for cultivating progress across the South, for working to unconditionally improve the lives of all, and for the bold underwriting of every Gravy podcast. SFA thanks our visionary Louisville, Kentucky friends, Pam and Brooke Smith.
On August 29, 2021, Hurricane Ida barreled over Louisiana.
Hurricane Ida putting New Orleans on high alert, supplies disappearing in an all-too-familiar rush.
I was living in an apartment in New Orleans. That morning, I started simmering beans in a crock pot, hoping they would finish cooking before the power went out. I figured that some beans would provide me enough sustenance if I lost electricity for a day or two, as I usually did during storms. Hours later, as Ida thrashed the city, the lights at my apartment flickered and then went out. This was not unusual. But then, the entire city lost power. This was unusual.
No doubt a tough night in New Orleans tonight, where there is a blackout. Hurricane Ida has knocked out the power to the entire city and much of Jefferson Parish.
It's gone. The power's all gone. In fact, there is no light anywhere.
It is black, and we're not going to get that power back maybe until tomorrow, possibly days, weeks. We don't know, because it is such a catastrophic issue.
It would eventually take almost 2 weeks to restore power across New Orleans. Many of my friends chose to leave the city, knowing it would be uncomfortable or even dangerous to remain in the summer heat without air conditioning. I chose to stay, so did others. Some didn't have a choice. I joke that those days after the storm were the best of times and the worst of times. I remember an ample feast with friends where we threw everything from our freezers onto a grill, hoping to eat up as much food as we could before it spoiled. We had boudin and chicken thighs and steaks, all while drinking warm beers and seltzers. As I drove through the city, I would witness culinary ingenuity. I see neighbors with headlamps on, cooking over grills and camp stoves, all in an attempt to make a nice warm meal that night. And it always smelled so delicious. Once, while organizing a caravan to deliver gasoline to folks in the bayou, a stranger offered me the most satiating dish I've ever eaten. It was cannellini beans with celery dressed in lemon and olive oil and garlic. I can still taste it today. Of course, I also ate a lot of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and granola bars and potato chips. But Hurricane Ida was also unimaginably difficult. It was hot and sticky. In New Orleans, multiple people died from the heat due to lack of air conditioning, and others died from carbon monoxide poisoning from their generators. I'd go to these city-run cooling facilities to luxuriate in air conditioning while charging my phone. There, I would see other residents like me who didn't leave the city, some of them unable to because of a lack of money or adequate transportation. One day, while sitting at one of these facilities, I scrolled on my phone and began to fall down a rabbit hole of disaster prep influencers. One blog led me to another, which led me to Reddit, which led me to YouTube videos, and eventually Amazon.
All right, guys, welcome back. Survival Living here. So today's video is actually an encouragement video trying to get you guys prepping hard.
Welcome back, survivalists. So FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, has a very specific list of items it wants all Americans to have.
I am here to tell you the best 10 prepper items that you can buy at Costco.
Easily, for most preppers, considered the most delicious of all the survival foods is potato flakes.
This is the 2-week food supply for one person.
I started assembling a massive wish list on Amazon. Tarps, battery-operated fans, water filters, plug-in burners, coolers, powdered milk, Ovaltine, dehydrated meat, potato flakes, canned green beans, machines that could can, machines that could dehydrate, machines that could help preserve and store food for dozens of people. When all was said and done, my wish list cost thousands of dollars, and I almost bought it all, even though I knew it wouldn't show up until well after the power had been restored. But I wanted to feel safe and secure, like another hurricane wouldn't totally disrupt my life. Since Ida, I've been curious about the world of disaster prep. Who is it for? How does it shape our imagination around disasters, like hurricanes? And how useful is it when disaster actually strikes?
That was Katie Fernelius, who reported and produced today's story. And I'm your host, Melissa Hall.
Gravy.
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 A production of the Southern Foodways Alliance, Gravy tells the stories of the changing American South. Today, we'll take a closer look at the culture of disaster prep, especially around how people eat when disaster strikes. When I say preppers, you probably begin to imagine giant tin cans full of vegetables, 40-pound sacks of rice, maybe a metric ton of beef jerky, or an underground storage room full of freeze-dried meals. But how people provision for disaster can differ wildly from how they actually feed themselves and each other once the storm blows through. Now back to Katie Jane Fernelius in New Orleans for the story.
I'm Chad Huddleston. I am a cultural anthropologist in St. Louis, Missouri, and my research has been on preppers for the past 15 years or so, and kind of all the things they do, and including how they eat.
Chad's been following preppers for a long time. He's gone to their meetups and conventions. He's gotten first-hand looks at their pantries and stores. He knows them beyond their stereotypes. So I wanted to talk to Chad so I could learn more about who preps, for what, and why. Chad told me that to begin to understand the answers to these questions, we need to understand the history of prepping in America. Now, for a lot of American history, what we call prepping was just par for the course. Many people lived in rural areas where storing a good amount of food and water to endure droughts and winters and slow supply chains was just expected. There weren't electrified refrigerators or well-stocked supermarkets. Communities had to prepare and preserve food for the long haul.
This church used to have canning stations around the country, and there was one here in St. Louis.
This kind of long-term storage and preparation was even a directive in the Doctrine and Covenants of Joseph Smith, who wrote that the Lord above had lovingly commanded Mormons to prepare every needful thing in case adversity struck. But after World War II, that began to change. Cue economic boom times, highways, suburbs, supermarkets, American consumerism.
Mass consumption makes you the most powerful giant in the land. And you have the best tools in the world to work with. On the job, that is. These tools make you the world's most productive worker. And the money you earn gives you the purchasing power that makes you a real giant.
Then, Cold War, oil crisis, Vietnam War, threat of nuclear warfare.
What if a warning siren sounds? What should you do? Look for cover, the nearest cover.
With all that emerged a subculture. First, they were called retreaters, then survivalists. They built fallout shelters behind their houses and prepared bunkers in remote areas. This culture really accelerated in the 60s and 70s. There were books, seminars, newsletters, and little by little, survivalism grew into a multi-million-dollar industry. Yes, the purpose was to find a way to initially survive a potentially cataclysmic event, but it also was to endure afterwards. And to do that, you needed food. So these survivalists built up their pantries.
For early preppers and people stockpiling foods, and especially in the 70s, 80s, it was mostly about canned goods. And for some folks, that might actually mean canning things, and going through that process of canning things, but mostly buying bulk canned goods.
So canned goods were common.
It's often like enormous cans of peaches and beans and rice, or, some kind of carb, lots of mashed potatoes or potato-derived things.
As the Cold War came to a close, survivalists came to be associated with extreme libertarianism and fringe Christian groups, like the Branch Davidians. It was a culture belonging to the paranoid. Just think of the character of Dale Gribble in King of the Hill, who has cartons of cigarettes and barrels of Mountain Dew stored in his basement. But at the turn of the century, that began to change. There was Y2K, 9/11. Then, in 2005, Hurricane Katrina.
But the preppers that I worked with most closely, they looked at Hurricane Katrina as their touchstone. And I think the big reason for that was, one, we saw Katrina happening on TV, like we could watch it every night on the news. And not only the things that people were going through, but the government failures every day of not being there, and these people sitting in the stadium, these people on the highways, these people, on the rooftops, not being rescued for days, not having food, not having water.
After Katrina, prepping took off. And what's the first thing Americans do when they pick up a new hobby? They buy gear. People met up on chat boards or in real life and exchanged tips on what to buy and where to find it. They discussed Mormon canneries and outdoor gear stores where it was easier to buy canned and dehydrated foods in bulk.
The big shift was the availability and probably the expense as in terms of being less expensive of dehydrated foods.
And in recent years, with a tumultuous political environment and intensifying climate change, prepping has started to go mainstream. Chad says that people can now buy prepper foods everywhere.
When I started this research, all of the preppers that I knew kind of went to one or two websites because that stuff was not available on Amazon at the time. And now that's where everyone gets everything because the delivery is so much faster.
Today, the typical prepper's pantry may look a little more diverse than a survivalist's in the 70s, even if they both still feature a lot of canned and dehydrated foods. But the big shift is not just in the availability of products, but also in the cultural shift. For many people, prepping is less about belonging to a niche community and developing a certain skill set, and more about buying stuff.
Any kind of prepping material that you would want is out there, and someone's willing to sell it to you for a prime price. And that gives people that sense of control as well. Like, oh, I bought the food, I bought that backpack full of gear, so now I'm done. Now I just got to wait for the apocalypse to happen, and I'm ready.
So what do you do when a disaster actually happens?
As somebody who has my kit, so I've got my things together, I don't know that I've ever actually once used it.
When we come back, we'll find out what happens when disaster prep meets disaster aftermath. But first,
Maker's Mark bourbon is aged to taste in Loretto, Kentucky. The Samuels family uses locally grown, soft red winter wheat and sources water from a lake on the distillery's campus. Every Maker's Mark label is printed and die-cut by hand on an antique press, and each bottle is hand-dipped in their signature red wax. All the details matter when distilling quality bourbon. Since Maker's Mark sold its first case of bourbon to the Keeneland Racecourse in Lexington, they have perfected the craft of distilling American whiskey. For their dedication to making great bourbon and for their support of the Southern Foodways Alliance, we thank them. Maker's Mark crafts their bourbon carefully. Please enjoy it that way.
Okay, so what happens when you actually live through a disaster? How useful is all that prepping actually?
The sort of common wisdom is that you need to be able to be self-sufficient for 3 to 5 days. While I think it's great for folks to, be prepared, I will say, and I, as somebody who has my kit, so I've got my things together, I don't know that I've ever actually once used it.
This is Miriam Belblidia. She did disaster and community care work with Imagine Waterworks, one of the more wide-reaching mutual aid groups here in New Orleans. Miriam says that in her line of work, there's a lot of emphasis on preparation via stockpiling. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, shares lists of what should be in each household's emergency kit, like food, water, medication.
But I think that really, when it comes down to it, we don't all need to have an individual kit. What we need to have is better resource sharing.
Resource sharing is at the heart of the mutual aid work that Miriam does. It's about figuring out who has what and how much they have to share. Maybe someone has a fig tree and has way more figs than they can eat. Maybe someone runs a store that has extra baby formula to spare. This type of mutual aid has been key in other disasters, including in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene in western North Carolina and across Appalachia. There, local community groups funneled desperately needed resources like baby supplies and menstrual products to impacted residents. That was all done by the local community. The fundamental thing is that it's not about individual resources, but community resources. Like me, Miriam stayed here in New Orleans after Hurricane Ida. And while it was undoubtedly a terrible storm, one thing that Miriam remembers is eating well, largely because of what resources were available across our city.
You know, the thing that happens after a storm is that everybody's trying to empty their freezers and their fridges before the food goes bad. And so everybody's grilling, and like folks are really freely sharing resources with their, friends and neighbors. So, a friend of a friend like spatchcocked a chicken, which I didn't even know what that was until then. But it was a pretty fancy meal that was done, on a grill with headlamps on and candles. But we ate so well. And then the other thing that happens, and this is a shout out to all of our local businesses, is that local restaurants are far more likely to share their resources.
Miriam remembers one pizza restaurant giving away all of its mozzarella. Another cafe gave away pastries and bread.
I literally just drove around the 7th Ward and handed out that food to people who were outside grilling. The misconception, perhaps, is that there's a shortage after disasters. And at least in my experience, what I have seen is that often there's many more resources in the immediate aftermath. Certainly things get far messier during the recovery period. But in the immediate aftermath, what I have witnessed is resources that people should have access to all the time exist.
This type of food, mozzarella, a spatchcocked chicken, or cannellini beans, it all stands in contrast to the food provided by the National Guard, especially their MREs, that is, meals ready to eat. For the uninitiated, an MRE includes about 1,200 calories. And calories are the right metric here, since the meal is intended to provide basic sustenance and not much else. An MRE usually consists of a bundle of brown plastic packages. Usually there's a main meal like shelf-stable beef goulash or cheese tortellini, and a side dish like crackers and cheese, and a dessert. In some ways, MREs are the original prepper food, but they aren't exactly the first thing most people reach for when they have a choice.
I don't know a single person who eats MREs. Do you?
Not if they could help it. I mean, an MRE, if you are truly without anything else, sure. Is it going to provide some sustenance? But, I have eaten an MRE really more out of curiosity. And it's not good. I feel like gelatinous is the word that comes to mind.
But beyond being unappetizing, Miriam says that MREs and a lot of typical prepper foods that are dehydrated and canned and unappetizing don't get at why food can be so important, especially in the wake of a disaster.
It's not just the taste of the MREs, which is, pretty disgusting. But it's also sort of what are the ways in which, food is being distributed? If it's the difference between handing somebody a prepackaged, vacuum sealed container versus dishing up a meal that has been cooked by somebody with care.
MREs may technically be useful. They do contain calories, but they don't do what good food can do.
There's a big difference between thinking about food as, what you need to survive, the basic calories, and then the sort of social functions and care functions that food plays. Food becomes this crucial thing, not only, again, for sort of survival, but it's the way that we mark our days. It's the way that we come together. It's the way we socialize. It's the way we care for each other.
There's a certain popular imaginary of disaster, the kind you see in zombie apocalypse movies, where it's every man out for himself. But time after time, experience shows that people typically come together after disasters and help each other. And one way that they do that is through the sharing of meals. That certainly was my experience after Ida, and it was Miriam's too.
I think fundamentally, humans are hardwired to be in connection and to look out for each other. And when we are not operating within systems that are designed to keep us sort of separate and in competition, I think that our natural default is to err on the side of resource sharing.
So what if we stop seeing disaster prep and response as something we can buy our way out of? Now, that doesn't mean keeping some extra canned foods around the house isn't a helpful or good thing to do. It totally is. And listen, I am not going to challenge FEMA's recommendations. It's probably good to have 5 days of food, water, and medication on hand. I know I do. But it does mean we should probably also give the same amount of attention to getting to know our neighbors and figuring out how we might help each other as we do to building up our pantries. This means we'll be ready to take care of each other when an emergency happens.
The best way that you can prepare is to have a pretty solid network of people that you can draw upon so that you don't need to all, everyone doesn't need to have everything. You just need to collectively have it.
We can't control natural disasters. We can't prepare for every eventuality. I mean, just this hurricane season, we saw the disastrous effects of storms on places most of us probably never thought of as hurricane targets. But perhaps our best hope is to pair a modicum of individual preparation with the community networks that will best set us up for resilience and recovery.
Katie Jane Fernelius, a frequent Gravy contributor, is a journalist, writer, and creative producer living in New Orleans. Katie is a founding member of Sidewalk Radio, a cooperatively owned production company in New Orleans. They developed, pitched, and produced the audio series A Field Guide to Gay Animals, which was an official selection of the 2024 Tribeca Festival and recommended by The New Yorker, WNYC, and New York Magazine. We thank Wendell Patrick for Gravy's theme music. We also owe a huge thank you to Clay Jones and Broadcast Studios in Oxford, Mississippi for recording and mixing Gravy. Managing editor for Gravy and all other SFA media is Sarah Camp Milam. Olivia Terenzio is our podcast editor. Fact-checking comes courtesy of Heather Cole. Mary Beth Lassiter is our publisher. Visit us at southernfoodways.org to learn more about our work. While you're there, watch a film, listen to an oral history, read an article from our sister publication, Gravy Quarterly, or make a donation. Your dollars fund our work and help us make more Gravy. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a rating or review and tell a friend. There is plenty of gravy to go around.